Interstate 90 cuts through Montana like a frozen scar, and on this February night, the blizzard was winning. Wind howled at 70 miles per hour, turning the highway into a death trap where even seasoned truckers pulled over and prayed. That's when Marcus Steele Rodriguez spotted something moving in the white hell, a German shepherd, barely alive, shielding 3 tiny puppies against the guardrail. Most people would have driven past, but Steele wasn't most people. Behind the skull tattoos and Hell's Angels vest was a secret the Brotherhood knew nothing about. Before the leather and the bike, he'd been Dr. Marcus Rodriguez, a veterinarian who'd lost everything in a malpractice lawsuit that destroyed his career and his faith in himself. Now, staring at this dying mother fighting to keep her babies warm, something awakened in him that had been buried for years. The storm was getting worse. His bike was his only transportation, and these animals would die without immediate help. What Steele didn't know was that saving these lives would expose the very secret that could destroy him, or finally set him free. But here's the question that haunts this story. Can a man rebuild his soul by saving what he once failed to protect? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Steele cut his Harley's engine and let the silence engulf him, broken only by the screaming wind. The headlight beam cut through the swirling snow, illuminating the huddled mass of fur and desperation. His leather gloves gripped the handlebars as muscle memory from another life kicked in, assessing breathing patterns, checking for shock, calculating survival odds. The German shepherd's eyes found his through the storm. Even from 20 feet away, he could see the pleading intelligence there, the maternal desperation that transcended species. She was hypothermic, bleeding from her hind leg, but still positioned protectively over her newborns. "Shit," Steele muttered, his breath forming ice crystals in his beard. He hadn't touched an animal medically in 3 years. The last time had been in a sterile courtroom where lawyers tore apart his reputation like vultures, where a simple surgical complication had become criminal negligence, where Dr. Marcus Rodriguez had died and Steele had been born from the ashes. But the puppies were dying. Steele dismounted and approached slowly, his boots crunching through the accumulated snow. The mother's ears flattened, a low growl rumbling from her chest despite her weakness. She was protecting her babies with what little strength remained. "Easy, girl," he said, dropping to his knees 5 feet away. "I know you don't trust me. Can't say I blame you." His voice carried the rough edge of cigarettes and whiskey, but underneath lay the gentle tone he'd once used with frightened animals every day. The wind picked up, driving snow like needles against his exposed face. Steele unzipped his leather jacket and pulled out a tactical flashlight. The small beam revealed what his professional eye had already suspected. The puppies couldn't be more than a few days old, eyes still closed, completely dependent on their mother's warmth. The mother dog's head began to droop. She was losing consciousness. Steele moved fast, shedding his jacket as he crawled forward. The mother didn't have the strength to resist as he gently lifted the first puppy, a tiny black and tan male barely the size of his palm, no movement. He pressed his ear to the miniature chest, weak heartbeat, but there, hypothermic. Working quickly, he transferred all 3 puppies inside his jacket against his thermal shirt. Their bodies were cold as stones. The second puppy, slightly larger, stirred weakly against his chest. The third, smallest of all, showed no signs of life. The mother's breathing was becoming shallow and rapid. Classic shock. Steele pressed his fingers against her neck, feeling for a pulse, thready and fast. Internal bleeding, possibly from giving birth in these conditions, definitely from whatever had injured her leg. His hands moved automatically, checking her gums, pale, indicating blood loss, feeling along her abdomen, distended, likely internal hemorrhaging. In a clinic, he'd have 4 fluids, warming blankets, surgical options. Here, in the middle of a Montana death storm, he had his body heat and desperate improvisation. Steele stripped off his thermal shirt, wrapping it around the mother's core. She whimpered, but didn't resist as he lifted her substantial weight, staggering toward his bike. The puppies squirmed weakly against his bare chest, their tiny claws catching on his skin. The Harley wasn't designed for rescue missions. Steele had to think fast. His saddlebags contained only basic tools and emergency supplies, but there was a travel blanket. Emergency heat packs from his winter kit. He activated 2 heat packs with his teeth, tucking them carefully around the mother dog as he positioned her across the bike's rear seat. The nearest town was Billings, 40 miles east. In this storm, it might as well have been 400. But 12 miles ahead was the Crow Creek truck stop. He'd passed it on his way west, noticed the attached diner was still open despite the weather. Steele climbed onto the Harley, adjusting the unconscious mother dog against his back while keeping the puppies secured inside his jacket. The smallest one still wasn't moving. The motorcycle roared to life, cutting through the storm's howl. As he pulled back onto the highway, fighting wind gusts that tried to knock them into the ditch, Steele found himself murmuring reassurances to animals that probably couldn't hear him. Words he hadn't spoken in years, promises he wasn't sure he could keep. The storm was getting worse, but for the first time in 3 years, Dr. Marcus Rodriguez was driving towards something instead of away from it. The Harley's engine died with a mechanical sigh, leaving only the howling wind and the soft whimper that had made Jake Reeves pull over in the first place. He sat motionless for a moment, his gloved hands still gripping the handlebars, wondering if he'd imagined it. The sound came again, weak, desperate, barely audible above the storm. Jake swung his leg over the bike and immediately felt the full force of the blizzard hit him. Snow stung his face like tiny needles, and the cold cut through his leather jacket as if it were paper. He pulled his collar up and trudged toward the guardrail where he'd heard the sound, his boots crunching through snow that was already ankle-deep. There, huddled beneath a twisted piece of metal that must have fallen from a truck, was a German shepherd. Her coat was matted with snow and blood, her brown eyes wide with exhaustion and fear. But it wasn't the dog that made Jake's breath catch. It was what lay beneath her, barely visible in the dim light of his bike's headlamp. "Jesus," he whispered, dropping to his knees beside her. 4 tiny puppies, no more than a few days old, pressed against their mother's belly. Their eyes weren't even open yet, and they moved with the blind urgency of newborns seeking warmth and milk. The mother dog lifted her head slightly, studying Jake with a mixture of wariness and desperate hope. Jake had seen plenty of desperate situations in his 43 years, most of them involving humans who'd made spectacularly bad choices. But this was different. This was pure innocence caught in nature's crosshairs, and something deep in his chest tightened at the sight. "Easy, Mama," he said softly, extending his hand palm down for her to smell. "I'm not going to hurt you." The dog's nose twitched as she caught his scent. Whatever she detected there must have satisfied her because she lowered her head back down, too exhausted to maintain her vigilant pose. Jake could see she was in bad shape. There was a gash along her left flank, probably from whatever accident had left her stranded here, and her breathing was shallow and labored. The wind picked up, driving the snow horizontal across the highway. Jake knew they had maybe an hour before the road became completely impassable, even for his bike. After that, they'd all be trapped out here until the storm passed, which could be days. The puppies wouldn't last that long, and neither would their mother. Jake pulled out his phone, though he already knew what he'd find. No signal. He was at least 30 miles from the nearest town in either direction, and the storm had knocked out what little cell coverage existed in this remote stretch of Montana wilderness. "Looks like it's just you and me, girl," he said, shrugging off his leather jacket despite the immediate bite of cold. He wrapped it around the small family, creating a makeshift shelter. The mother dog's tail gave the faintest wag. Whether from gratitude or the simple animal recognition of kindness, Jake couldn't tell. He considered his options. His bike could handle the snow for now, but not with passengers. Even if he could somehow secure the dog and puppies, the exposure would likely kill them before he reached help. Going for help and coming back wasn't an option either. By the time he returned, if he could find this spot, again in the storm, it would be too late. That left one choice, and it was a long shot at best. Jake remembered passing an old hunting cabin about 10 miles back. set maybe a quarter-mile off the highway. It had looked abandoned, but it would provide shelter from the storm. If he could get there, he could at least buy them all time to wait out the worst of it. But carrying an injured dog and 4 newborn puppies on foot through a blizzard was borderline suicidal. "I must be losing my damn mind," he muttered, but he was already moving. Jake walked back to his bike and opened the hard case saddlebag. Inside, among the usual road gear, was a rolled-up sleeping bag and a small emergency kit. He'd learned long ago that traveling alone through places like this required preparation for the unexpected. He'd just never expected anything quite like this. He returned to the dogs and carefully lifted one of the puppies. It was impossibly small and light, fitting easily in his palm. Its tiny mouth opened in a silent mew, and Jake felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the crushing weight of being completely responsible for something utterly helpless. The mother dog watched nervously as he examined each puppy, but she didn't try to stop him. Somehow she seemed to understand that this strange human with the gentle hands and worried eyes was their only chance. Jake spread the sleeping bag on the ground and carefully moved the entire family onto it. The mother dog struggled to stand, her legs shaking with the effort, but Jake placed a firm hand on her shoulder. "Save your strength, Mama. We've got a long night ahead of us." The wind howled like a living thing as Marcus crouched beside the culvert, his leather jacket offering little protection against the biting cold. The mother dog watched him with amber eyes that held equal measures of desperation and wariness. Her black coat was matted with snow and ice, and he could see her ribs beneath the wet fur. She was starving. "Easy, girl," he murmured, keeping his voice low and steady. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog's ears flicked forward at his tone, but she didn't move from her protective stance over the tiny forms huddled beneath her. Marcus could barely make out the puppies. Maybe 3 or 4 of them, no bigger than his fist. In this cold, they wouldn't last the night. He reached slowly into his saddlebag and pulled out a package of beef jerky. The smell hit the air, and the mother's nostrils flared. Her tongue darted out briefly, but she held her ground. "That's it," Marcus said, tearing off a small piece and tossing it halfway between them. "You've got babies to feed. Can't do that if you're dead." The dog's resolve cracked. She darted forward, snatched the jerky, and retreated in one fluid motion. Marcus waited, then threw another piece, this one closer to his position. The pattern continued until she was eating from his outstretched hand, her rough tongue catching every crumb. Up close, he could see the intelligence in her eyes, the careful calculation of a mother weighing survival against risk. She reminded him of someone he'd tried hard to forget. The snow was falling heavier now, and the temperature was dropping fast. Marcus knew he had maybe an hour before hypothermia became a real concern for all of them. He pulled out his cell phone, unsurprised to find no signal. The storm had knocked out the nearest tower, leaving them completely cut off. "Okay, beautiful," he said to the dog, who had finished the jerky and was now allowing him to scratch behind her ears. "We need to get you and your babies somewhere warm." He stood and walked back to his Harley, the dog following at a cautious distance. From his other saddlebag, he retrieved a heavy wool blanket, army surplus, designed to keep soldiers alive in brutal conditions. It had saved his life more than once in Afghanistan. Returning to the culvert, Marcus spread the blanket on the ground. The mother dog sniffed it thoroughly before stepping onto it. Carefully, Marcus began gathering the puppies. They were so small, so fragile, their eyes still closed and their tiny bodies cold to the touch. 4 of them, all breathing but barely. "Can't take you on the bike," he told the mother, who watched his every move with laser focus. "But there's an old ranger station about 2 miles up the road. Think you can make it that far?" As if she understood, the dog looked toward the highway, then back at her puppies. Marcus wrapped them carefully in one corner of the blanket, creating a makeshift pouch he could carry against his chest. The mother whined softly but didn't try to stop him. The trek up Highway 2 was brutal. The wind cut through Marcus's leather like it was tissue paper, and the snow had already accumulated to knee-deep drifts. The mother dog struggled behind him, her paws breaking through the crust with each step. Twice she stumbled and fell, exhaustion taking its toll. Each time, Marcus waited for her to get back up, murmuring encouragement. The ranger station appeared through the swirling snow like a mirage, a small log building with boarded windows and a metal roof. Marcus had spotted it on his way through, noting the closed for season sign. Right now, closed was perfect, fewer complications. The lock on the front door was old and simple. Marcus's knife made short work of it, a skill learned in less legitimate years. Inside, the station was musty but dry, with a stone fireplace and stacks of seasoned wood. Most importantly, it was out of the wind. The mother dog collapsed just inside the door, her flanks heaving. Marcus quickly transferred the puppies back to her, watching as she immediately began cleaning them with her tongue, stimulating their circulation. Smart girl. Within minutes, Marcus had a fire crackling in the fireplace. The warmth spread slowly through the small space, and he watched the dogs shivering gradually subside. He found a metal bowl in the tiny kitchenette and filled it with snow to melt for water. As the storm raged outside, Marcus sat cross-legged near the fire, watching the small family. The mother had positioned herself so the puppies were closest to the warmth, her body curved protectively around them. One of the puppies, slightly larger than the others, had found a teat and was nursing vigorously. "You're a good mom," Marcus said quietly. "Reminds me of someone I knew once." The dog's tail thumped weakly against the floor, and for the first time since he'd found them, Marcus allowed himself to believe they might all make it through this. Outside, the wind continued to howl, but inside the ranger station, surrounded by the soft sounds of a family reunited, something cold and long frozen in Marcus's chest began to thaw. The wind howled like a wounded animal as Marcus crouched beside the makeshift shelter, his massive frame blocking what little warmth escaped from the Harley's engine. The mother dog, he'd started thinking of her as Lady, though he couldn't say why, watched his every movement with intelligent brown eyes that reminded him of someone he'd rather forget. "Easy, girl," he murmured, reaching slowly into his saddlebags. The leather was stiff with cold, fighting his numb fingers as he searched for the emergency supplies he always carried. Years of riding these mountain roads had taught him that preparation meant the difference between making it home and becoming a cautionary tale. Lady's breathing had grown more labored, her ribs expanding with visible effort. The three tiny bodies pressed against her belly were barely moving, their soft whimpers growing weaker by the minute. Marcus had seen enough death to recognize its approaching footsteps, and right now they were getting closer. His fingers found what he was looking for: a small camping stove and fuel canister, emergency rations, and most importantly, a thermal blanket designed for hypothermia victims. The irony wasn't lost on him that gear meant for humans might save a family of dogs on this godforsaken stretch of highway. The wind shifted suddenly, driving snow directly into their shelter. Lady whined and tried to curl tighter around her babies, but Marcus could see her strength failing. Without thinking, he stripped off his leather jacket and wrapped it around the small family, his own body immediately screaming in protest as the cold bit through his flannel shirt. "What the hell are you doing, Marcus?" he muttered to himself, setting up the camping stove with practiced efficiency. But even as he questioned his sanity, his hands moved with purpose. The small blue flame came to life, a beacon of hope in the whiteout conditions. 23 years ago, he'd made a different choice on a night not unlike this one. The memory crashed over him like the waves that had claimed his daughter's life. Sarah, barely 6 years old, who'd called him Daddy and believed he could fix anything. The night she'd needed him most, he'd been 3 states away, running drugs for the club and convinced that providing money was the same as providing love. The call had come at 2 a.m. house fire, smoke inhalation. If he'd been there, maybe he would have heard the smoke detector's failing battery, maybe he would have gotten her out in time. Instead, he'd arrived at the hospital 12 hours too late, still wearing the same leather jacket that now warmed a stranger's family. Lady's breathing hitched, pulling him back to the present. One of the puppies had stopped moving entirely. Marcus reached out instinctively, his calloused fingers finding the tiny chest and feeling for a heartbeat. Nothing. "No," he said firmly, scooping the puppy into his palm. It was smaller than his cell phone, grey and white with markings that would have been beautiful given the chance to grow. He began chest compressions with one finger, breathing gently into the tiny nose every few seconds. The technique had been useless 23 years ago. You can't perform CPR on someone who died in their sleep from smoke inhalation hours before you even knew there was a fire. But this was different. This was happening now, and he was here. "Come on, little fighter," he whispered, continuing the rhythm. "Press, press, breathe. Press, press, breathe." Lady watched him with an expression that seemed almost human in its desperation. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, the puppy gasped. Then again, its tiny chest began rising and falling on its own, and Marcus felt something crack open inside his chest, not breaking but expanding. He placed the puppy back against its mother's warmth and checked the other two. Both were breathing, but barely. The camping stove had created a small pocket of warmth, but it wouldn't be enough if the storm continued much longer. His CB radio crackled from the bike, barely audible over the wind. Marcus lunged for it, hope flaring in his chest. "Emergency services, road closure, anyone out there?" Marcus grabbed the handset. "This is Marcus Kane, mile marker 47 on Highway 2. I've got an emergency situation here." The response was immediate but discouraging. "Copy that. All emergency vehicles grounded due to whiteout conditions. Can you make it to shelter?" Marcus looked back at Lady and her babies. The mother dog couldn't walk, and the puppies wouldn't survive being moved in this cold. "Negative. I'm staying put. Sir, temperature's dropping to -20. You need to—" Marcus turned off the radio. He'd made his choice the moment he'd stopped, just like he should have made a different choice 23 years ago. Some mistakes you live with forever. Others, if you're lucky, you get the chance to not make again. He settled back down beside Lady, pulling the thermal blanket tighter around all of them. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside their small shelter, 5 hearts kept beating against the cold. The abandoned gas station materialized through the swirling snow like a ghost from another era. Its broken neon sign hung at a dejected angle, and the windows were boarded up with plywood that had weathered to a dull grey. But the overhang still provided shelter, and that was all Marcus needed right now. He guided his Harley under the concrete canopy and killed the engine. The sudden silence felt almost violent after hours of wind and road noise. In his jacket, the mother dog had gone still, her breathing shallow but steady. He could feel the faint trembling that ran through her small body with each breath. Marcus swung his leg over the bike and carefully opened his jacket. The dog's dark eyes found his immediately, alert despite her obvious exhaustion. She made no move to escape, as if she understood that this strange alliance was her only chance. "Easy, girl," he murmured, his voice rough from the cold. "Let's see what we're dealing with." The building's front door had been chained shut years ago, but Marcus found a side entrance where the lock had rusted through. The door groaned open to reveal a small office space thick with dust and shadows. It wasn't much, but it was dry and out of the wind. He pulled a flashlight from his saddlebag and swept the beam across the room. A metal desk sat against one wall, its surface scarred with water stains. In the corner, a pile of old newspapers had been arranged into what looked like a makeshift bed, probably left by some other traveler seeking shelter. Marcus set the dog down gently on the newspapers. She immediately began sniffing around the small space, her tail tucked low but no longer trembling. The warmth was already helping. "Now comes the hard part," he said, more to himself than to her. He returned to his bike and began unloading supplies. Emergency blanket, first aid kit, a thermos of coffee that had somehow stayed warm, and most importantly, the small bottle of puppy formula he'd picked up at the last truck stop. He'd told himself it was stupid to carry it, that the puppies were probably already gone, but something had made him buy it anyway. Back inside, he spread the emergency blanket over the newspapers and coaxed the dog onto it. She settled down with a soft whine. her sides heaving. Marcus positioned the flashlight so it provided ambient light without shining directly in her eyes. "All right, Mama," he said softly. "Time to go back for your babies." The dog's ears perked up at something in his tone. She watched as he pulled on an extra pair of gloves and checked his jacket pockets for the small bottles he'd fashioned into makeshift feeding devices. Marcus had delivered puppies before, though it had been 20 years since the last time. Back when he'd been someone else entirely, living a different life in a world that felt like it belonged to another person. Before everything had gone to hell, before he'd traded his veterinarian-esque coat for leather and his healing hands for ones that knew how to hurt. The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, hiding from his past, and it had found him anyway on a deserted highway in the middle of nowhere. He knelt beside the mother dog and ran his hands gently along her sides, feeling for signs of distress. Her abdomen was soft, which was good. It meant she'd likely delivered all the puppies, no complications that would require surgical intervention he couldn't provide. "You did good, girl," he whispered. "Now we just need to make sure everyone makes it through the night." Outside, the storm continued its assault. Wind rattled the boarded windows and found every crack in the old building's walls. But inside their makeshift shelter, a fragile peace had settled over them. The dog seemed to sense his knowledge, his capability. She relaxed under his touch in a way that spoke of some deep, instinctive trust. Animals had always been able to see past his exterior to whatever remained of the man he'd once been. Marcus checked his watch. If his calculations were right, they'd been separated from the puppies for nearly 3 hours. Newborns could survive that long without feeding, but not much longer. Every minute counted now. He stood and began preparing for the journey back. More blankets, the feeding supplies, and a larger flashlight with fresh batteries. The mother dog watched his preparations with growing agitation, as if she understood what was coming. "I know," he told her. "You want to come with me, but you're not strong enough yet, and I need you to be ready when I bring them back." She whined softly, a sound that cut straight through his chest. Marcus pulled his jacket tight and headed for the door. The storm was getting worse, but those puppies were running out of time, and despite everything he'd done to bury his past, he couldn't let them die. Not when he had the power to save them. The wind had died to a whisper by the time Marcus finished building the makeshift shelter. Using the emergency tarp from his bike's storage compartment and fallen branches, he'd created a crude but effective windbreak against the Harley's side. The mother dog, he'd started calling her lady in his mind, watched his every movement with intelligent amber eyes that reminded him painfully of another dog from another lifetime. "There we go, girl," he murmured, spreading his sleeping bag inside the shelter. "Not the Ritz, but it'll keep the worst of it off you and the little ones." Lady's tail thumped weakly against the snow. The bleeding from her hind leg had slowed, thanks to the torn strips of his undershirt he'd used as makeshift bandages, but she needed real medical attention. They all did. The 3 surviving puppies were so small they fit in his cupped palms, their eyes still sealed shut, tiny bodies barely warm despite being pressed against their mother's belly. Marcus checked his phone again. Still no signal. The storm might have passed, but they were still trapped in a dead zone 20 miles from the nearest town. His bike could make it through the remaining snow, but not with passengers this fragile. As he knelt beside Lady, gently checking her wounds, a memory surfaced unbidden. Another winter, another dog in need. Rex had been a German shepherd, retired from military service just like Marcus. They'd found each other at the VA hospital where Marcus was learning to walk again, learning to live with the shrapnel still embedded near his spine and the ghosts that followed him home from Afghanistan. Rex had been suffering from his own brand of PTSD. Loud noises sent him cowering, strangers made him aggressive. The doctors said he was too damaged for civilian life, that he'd have to be put down. But Marcus saw something familiar in those haunted brown eyes. He'd filled out the adoption papers that same day. For 3 years, they'd healed together. Rex helped Marcus through the nightmares, the flashbacks, the days when getting out of bed felt impossible. In return, Marcus gave Rex patience, understanding, and a safe place to remember how to trust again. They'd ride the highways together, Rex in a specially designed sidecar, both of them finding peace in the endless ribbon of asphalt, stretching toward horizons that promised new beginnings. Then came the accident. A drunk driver running a red light in Billings. Marcus had been thrown clear, suffered only road rash and bruised ribs. Rex hadn't been so lucky. Marcus blinked hard, forcing himself back to the present. Lady was watching him with those knowing eyes, as if she could sense the weight of his memories. One of the puppies, a tiny thing with markings that would probably turn golden like its mother, had worked its way partially out from under her protective belly and was mewling softly. "Hey there, little one," Marcus whispered, gently guiding the puppy back to warmth. "Stay close to Mama." The sound of an engine in the distance made him freeze. Through the trees he could see headlights cutting through the grey afternoon light. Marcus felt his chest tighten. Out here, alone with a disabled animal, and no easy way to prove his good intentions, his appearance could easily be misinterpreted. The leather jacket, the cuts showing his club affiliation, the general hard-worn look of a man who'd spent years running from his past, none of it screamed Good Samaritan. The vehicle slowed as it approached the accident scene. Marcus could make out a red pickup truck, Montana plates, a gun rack visible in the rear window. The driver would be able to see his bike, the improvised shelter, and inevitably Marcus himself. He stood slowly, hands visible and non-threatening, as the pickup pulled over. The driver was a woman in her 50s, grey hair pulled back under a wool cap, wearing a practical winter coat that had seen many Montana winters. She rolled down her window cautiously. "Everything all right here?" she called out, her voice carrying the particular wariness of someone who'd learned to be careful on empty highways. "Yes, ma'am," Marcus replied, staying well back from her vehicle. "Found a dog that got hit by a car. She's got newborn puppies with her. I've been trying to keep them warm, but they need to get to a vet." The woman's expression shifted from suspicion to concern. "Puppies? In this weather?" She turned off her engine and climbed out, revealing muddy boots and the confident stride of someone equally comfortable with animals and difficult situations. "I'm Sarah Jensen. I run the animal rescue 20 miles up the highway." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest. Marcus. And right now you might be the best thing that's happened to this little family all day. Sarah approached the shelter, her experienced eyes taking in the situation immediately. "Well, I'll be damned," she murmured, crouching down to get a better look at Lady and her babies. "You did good work here, Marcus. Real good work." The warmth from Jake's body heat had kept the smallest puppy alive through the night, but barely. As dawn broke grey and bitter over the endless white landscape, he could feel the tiny creature's heartbeat fluttering weakly against his chest. The mother dog hadn't moved in hours, her breathing so shallow it was almost imperceptible. Jake's own strength was fading fast. The motorcycle jacket that had served him well through countless rides offered little protection against the savage Montana cold. His fingers were numb, his lips cracked and bleeding. Every breath sent ice crystals deep into his lungs. He'd survived worse, the rice paddies of Vietnam, the concrete hell of maximum security, but never while responsible for lives this fragile. The sound reached him before he could see anything through the swirling snow. A low rumble, different from the constant wind. His heart hammered as he recognized the deep growl of multiple motorcycles cutting through the storm. They were still too far away to signal, but getting closer. "Come on, darling," he whispered to the mother dog, his voice barely a rasp. "Your babies need you to hang on just a little longer." The pack emerged from the white curtain like ghosts materializing from another world. 7 bikes, riders hunched against the storm, moving in the tight formation that marked them as club brothers. Jake recognized the lead bike immediately, Tommy Razor Martinez on his customized Harley, the same bike he'd been riding when they'd pulled, Jake bleeding and half dead from that burning warehouse in Billings 3 years ago. The convoy slowed, then stopped in a semicircle around the overturned truck. Engines cut one by one until only the wind remained. Razor pulled off his helmet, revealing a weathered face mapped with scars, dark eyes scanning the scene with tactical precision. "Jesus Christ, Jake." Razor's voice carried a mixture of relief and disbelief. "Whole goddamn club's been looking for you since yesterday. Mickey said you took off like the devil himself was chasing you." Jake struggled to sit up straighter, protective arms still cradling the puppy. "Not the devil, brother. Just his cousin wearing a badge." The other riders dismounted, their leather cuts marking them as members of the Iron Wolves MC. Jake recognized most of them, hard men who'd accepted him into their brotherhood when the rest of the world had written him off as irredeemable. Men who understood that sometimes running toward danger was the only way to outrun your past. "What's the situation here?" Razor knelt beside Jake, his trained medic's eye assessing both human and canine patients. In Vietnam, he'd kept more than one soldier breathing long enough to reach a field hospital. "Mother and 5 pups. Lost one already." Jake's voice cracked. "She's been trying to keep them alive in this truck since the storm hit. Been here all night with them." Razor's expression softened as he looked at the exhausted dog and her babies. The other club members gathered closer, these men who'd earned their fearsome reputation in barroom brawls and territory wars, now studying the small family with unexpected tenderness. "Tiny's got a veterinarian contact in Kalispell," offered Bear, a massive rider whose gentle handling of the surviving puppies contradicted his intimidating appearance. "Woman who patches up animals, no questions asked." "That's still 40 miles through this shit," growled Diesel, gesturing at the storm that showed no signs of letting up. "Roads are probably impassable." Razor stood, decision crystallizing in his dark eyes. "Then we make them passable. Spike, you and Bear take point, break trail. Diesel, your sweep. Rest of us form escort formation." He looked down at Jake. "You're riding bitch with me, brother. Keep those babies warm." Jake felt a surge of gratitude that nearly overwhelmed him. These men owed him nothing, yet they were willing to risk their lives riding through a blizzard to save a stray dog and her litter. It was the kind of loyalty that couldn't be bought or faked, earned only through shared blood and brotherhood. "What about the truck driver?" Jake nodded toward the cab where the man still lay unconscious. "Snake already checked him," Razor replied. "Concussion, but breathing steady. We'll radio his location to State Patrol once we get clear of this storm." The loading process was careful and deliberate. Jake climbed onto the back of Razor's bike, the tiny puppy still tucked inside his jacket. Bear and Diesel rigged a makeshift carrier for the mother dog and remaining puppies, cushioned with spare riding gear and positioned where engine heat would keep them warm. As the convoy prepared to move out, Jake looked back one last time at the overturned truck, already being swallowed by the drifting snow. 12 hours ago, he'd been running from his demons, convinced he was beyond redemption. Now, surrounded by his brothers and cradling a life he'd helped save, he felt something he hadn't experienced in years: hope. The engines roared to life, 7 riders beginning their dangerous journey through the storm, carrying precious cargo toward an uncertain but fighting chance. The snow had stopped, but the silence that followed felt more ominous than the howling wind. Jake crouched beside the makeshift shelter he'd built from his leather jacket and fallen branches, watching the mother dog's labored breathing. Her eyes, once alert and defiant, had grown glassy. The smallest puppy, the one he'd been trying to keep warm against his chest, hadn't moved in the last 10 minutes. He'd seen that look before. In Afghanistan, when Martinez took shrapnel to the chest and they couldn't get him to the medic fast enough. The same resignation, the same slow surrender to something bigger than willpower. Jake's hands trembled as he checked the puppy's tiny heartbeat. Nothing. "Damn it," he whispered, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. The irony wasn't lost on him. A man who'd spent 3 tours keeping people alive, now helpless to save something so small and innocent. The sound of an engine cut through the mountain silence. Jake's head snapped up, hope and caution warring in his chest. Headlights swept across the snow-covered highway, growing brighter. He stood slowly, his joints stiff from hours of crouching in the cold, and waved his arms above his head. The pickup truck slowed, then stopped about 20 feet away. Jake could see two figures in the cab, their faces obscured by the glare of the headlights. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out, tall, wearing a sheriff's department jacket. Jake's blood turned colder than the mountain air. "Well, well," Sheriff Morrison called out, his hand resting casually on his service weapon. "Jake Reeves. Should have known I'd find trouble where you are." Jake kept his hands visible, his voice steady. "Sheriff, these animals need help. The mother's dying and—" "Save it," Morrison approached with the measured steps of a man used to being in control. "You know there's a warrant out for you? Parole violation. Your officer's been looking all over the state." Behind Morrison, his deputy emerged from the passenger side, younger and nervous-looking. Jake recognized the type, fresh from the academy, eager to please his superior. The kind who might shoot first and ask questions later. "I haven't violated anything," Jake said. "I'm traveling within state lines, and I checked in 2 days ago." Morrison laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Traveling with stolen property, though. That Harley's been reported missing from Billings." Jake's jaw tightened. He'd bought the bike legitimately, had the paperwork to prove it, but he knew Morrison wouldn't care about facts. This was personal, had been since the day Jake testified against Morrison's brother-in-law in a domestic violence case. Some grudges ran deeper than professional duty. "The bike's clean and you know it," Jake said. "But right now there's a dying dog here that needs—" "Turn around, hands behind your back." Morrison drew his weapon, and the deputy followed suit. The mother dog whimpered from behind Jake, a sound so weak it barely carried on the wind. One of the surviving puppies began to cry, a thin, desperate sound that cut through Jake like a blade. He thought of the small grave he'd have to dig when this was over, of the promise he'd made to Sarah's memory about protecting innocent things. "Please," Jake said, the word tasting like ash. "Give me 10 minutes. Let me at least get them warm, get them to a vet. Then I'll come quietly." Morrison's smile was predatory. "You're in no position to negotiate." The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "Sheriff, maybe you could keep your mouth shut, Hendricks." Morrison's voice carried the sharp crack of authority. "This man's a wanted criminal." Jake's mind raced. He could take Morrison. The sheriff had gotten soft behind his desk, and Jake still carried the reflexes of a soldier. But the deputy was an unknown quantity, and gunfire this close to the animals would be disastrous. More importantly, running would only make things worse for the dogs. If he was arrested, at least Morrison would have to call animal control. It wasn't much of a chance, but it was something. "All right," Jake said quietly, raising his hands. "But when these animals die because you were more interested in settling scores than doing your job, that's on you." Morrison cuffed him roughly, metal biting into Jake's wrists. "The only thing that's on me is cleaning up the mess you people make wherever you go." As they led him toward the truck, Jake looked back at the shelter. The mother dog's eyes found his across the snow, and he saw something there that made his chest ache. Trust. Even now, even dying, she trusted that he would keep his promise. The deputy opened the rear door of the truck, and Jake climbed inside without resistance. Through the back window, he could see the small shelter, already being claimed by the drifting snow. Morrison radioed for animal control, but Jake knew they wouldn't arrive in time. Sometimes salvation wore an unlikely disguise. Sometimes it didn't come at all. The wind had finally died to a whisper when Sarah's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her body ached so profoundly. Then the events came rushing back, the blizzard, the truck breaking down, the mother dog and tank. She turned her head slowly, expecting to see the massive biker still hunched over the cardboard box. But the space beside her was empty. Panic shot through her chest. Had he left them? Had she dreamed the gentleness in his voice when he spoke to the puppies? "Tank?" Her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. "Right here." His deep voice drifted from somewhere near the truck's engine. Relief flooded through her as she struggled to sit up, her muscles protesting every movement. Through the windshield, she could see him working under the hood, his leather jacket discarded, steam rising from his broad shoulders in the frigid air. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed into crystalline silence. Snowdrifts reached nearly to the truck's windows, but overhead, stars pierced through breaking clouds. The mother dog lifted her head as Sarah moved, those intelligent brown eyes tracking her every motion. 3 tiny puppies nursed contentedly, while a 4th, smaller than the rest, lay motionless near the edge of the makeshift nest. Sarah's heart clenched. Oh no. The truck door opened with a metallic groan as Tank climbed back in, bringing a rush of Arctic air. His face was grim, oil staining his massive hands. Engines seized. "We're not driving out of here." "One of the puppies." Sarah gestured helplessly toward the still form. Tank's expression softened as he looked down at the box. Without hesitation, he reached for the motionless puppy, cradling it in his enormous palm. For several long moments, he worked with practiced efficiency, clearing the tiny airway, providing gentle stimulation, his rough fingers impossibly tender against the fragile creature. "Come on, little fighter," he murmured. "Don't give up now." Sarah watched in amazement as Tank continued his efforts, his entire focus concentrated on the barely formed life in his hands. This was the same man whose motorcycle club patches spoke of violence and rebellion, yet here he was, breathing life back into a creature that could fit in a coffee cup. A tiny gasp, barely audible, escaped the puppy. Then another. Tank's scarred face broke into a smile that transformed his entire appearance. "There you are." He carefully placed the puppy back with its mother, who immediately began licking it clean. "Sometimes they just need a little extra time to figure out this breathing thing." "How did you know how to do that?" Sarah asked, studying this contradiction of a man. Tank settled back against the seat, his eyes distant. "Had a lot of practice once upon a time." He was quiet for a long moment, watching the puppy find its way to nurse alongside its siblings. "Used to breed dogs before everything went to hell." Something in his tone warned Sarah not to push, but curiosity burned within her. Every assumption she'd made about him continued to crumble. "My daughter loved dogs," Tank continued unexpectedly, his voice barely above a whisper. "German shepherds, mostly. She was going to be a veterinarian." The past tense hung heavy between them. Sarah felt her chest tighten. "Was?" "Cancer." The single word carried the weight of 1,000 sleepless nights. "She was 12 when we lost her. After that, I couldn't stand to be around anything that reminded me of her dreams." The admission hung in the frigid air like visible breath. Sarah understood now. The gentleness with the animals, the careful way he handled each puppy, the pain that flickered behind his eyes when he thought no one was watching. "What was her name?" Sarah asked softly. Tank's voice cracked almost imperceptibly. She would have loved this, being snowed in with a litter of newborns, would have named each one and convinced me to keep them all. "Someone will come looking," Sarah said, though she wasn't sure if she was trying to convince him or herself. Tank nodded, but his attention had shifted to the horizon where a distant rumble was growing steadily louder. He squinted through the windshield, then broke into a genuine grin. "Won't have to wait long." He pointed toward a growing cloud of snow spray in the distance. "That's Mac on his plow truck. Stubborn bastard, probably drove all night looking for me." As the rescue vehicle drew closer, Sarah found herself strangely reluctant for this strange interlude to end. In the space of one impossible night, her understanding of the world, of the masks people wore and the pain they carried, had shifted fundamentally. Tank caught her watching him and offered a small smile. "Don't worry, we'll make sure these little ones get somewhere safe." The storm had transformed the world into something unrecognizable. What had been a narrow mountain highway 12 hours ago was now buried under 3 feet of snow, with drifts reaching twice that height against the abandoned cars scattered along the route. Marcus pressed his face against the frost-covered window of the stranded semi-truck, watching the blizzard rage with a fury that seemed almost personal. "Never seen anything like this in 30 years of driving," the trucker Dale muttered from behind him. The cab smelled of diesel fuel, cold coffee, and the metallic tang of fear. Weather Service is calling it a once-in-a-century storm. Wind speeds hitting 70 miles per hour. Marcus nodded absently, his thoughts consumed by the makeshift shelter he built around the dog and her puppies nearly a quarter-mile behind them. The tarp and branches he'd gathered wouldn't hold against winds like these. Even with the emergency blankets from his saddlebags, they were fighting a losing battle against nature's assault. "You keep looking back there," Dale observed, following Marcus's gaze. "Something you're worried about?" "There's a dog," Marcus said simply. "New mother. Puppies." Dale's weathered face softened. "Jesus. In this weather?" "I found them this morning, built them some shelter, but—" Marcus gestured helplessly at the wall of white beyond the windshield. "They won't make it through the night," Dale finished grimly. "Hell, we might not make it through the night." 3 other vehicles were scattered within shouting distance along this stretch of highway, a family in a minivan, an elderly couple in a sedan, and a college kid in a beat-up Honda. They'd all been checking on each other periodically, sharing supplies and information. The CB radio crackled occasionally with updates from other stranded motorists, but the news wasn't encouraging. State highway crews were pulled back until the storm passed. Search and rescue operations were suspended. They were on their own. Marcus checked his watch, 4:47 p.m. Sunset would come early behind the storm clouds, and the temperature was already dropping fast. He'd given the dog most of his emergency rations, keeping only enough to maintain his own strength, but strength wouldn't matter if they all froze to death. "I have to go back to them," he said, reaching for his leather jacket. Dale grabbed his arm. "You'll die out there. Visibility is maybe 10 feet. You'll get turned around and lost, then we'll have to search for your body come spring. They're depending on me. And you're no good to them dead." Dale's grip tightened. "Look, I've got a emergency shelter kit in my sleeper berth, military grade. And there's a camp stove, more blankets. If you're determined to play hero, at least do it smart." Marcus hesitated. The logical part of his mind knew Dale was right about the visibility. He could easily become disoriented in the storm and never find his way back to either the dog or the truck. But the image of those tiny puppies, barely a day old, wouldn't leave him alone. His radio crackled to life. "Anyone out there? This is Jenny in the minivan. Our heater just died. 4, 2 adults, 2 kids, ages 8 and 5. Marcus closed his eyes. The storm was claiming victims faster than they could help each other. Every decision now carried life or death consequences. "Dale, this is Frank in the sedan." Another voice broke through the static. "I'm a retired mechanic. I can take a look at that heater if someone can help me get there. Visibility is near 0, Frank. Too dangerous. Those kids won't last till morning without heat." Marcus felt the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Save the children or save the dog and puppies? Save Frank from a dangerous rescue attempt or let a family freeze? Every instinct screamed at him to act, but the storm had paralyzed them all with its sheer brutality. "Wait," he said suddenly, an idea forming. "Dale, how much rope do you carry?" "Maybe 200 feet of climbing rope." "Why?" "We tie ourselves together, create a lifeline between vehicles. That way we can move between them safely and pool our resources." Dale nodded slowly. "Might work, but it's still dangerous as hell. Everything's dangerous now, but if we work together, we might all make it through this." Within an hour, they'd established a rope network connecting all the stranded vehicles. Frank successfully repaired the minivan's heater. The college kid, Tommy, turned out to have medical training and was treating an elderly woman's hypothermia symptoms, and Marcus had retrieved Dale's military shelter kit. As darkness fell and the storm continued its relentless assault, Marcus prepared for what might be the most dangerous journey of his life. 200 yards through a blizzard to reach a dog and her babies who trusted him completely. He pulled on every piece of warm clothing he could find and checked the rope one final time. The vet's office hummed with quiet efficiency as Dr. Sarah Chen finished examining the last of the puppies. Marcus stood against the wall, arms crossed, watching her gentle movements as she checked tiny heartbeats and listened to miniature lungs. The mother dog, whom Sarah had dubbed Grace, lay contentedly on the examination table, finally allowing someone else to fuss over her babies. "They're all going to make it," Sarah announced, pulling her stethoscope away from the smallest pup's chest. "Remarkable, really. Another few hours in that cold and we'd be having a very different conversation." Marcus felt something tight in his chest loosen. He'd carried enough death on his conscience. The thought of losing these innocent creatures had been eating at him since he'd first heard their weak cries in the storm. "What happens now?" he asked. Sarah glanced up at him, noting the genuine concern in his voice. In her 15 years as a veterinarian, she'd learned to read people as well as animals. This man, with his intimidating exterior and gentle hands, was full of contradictions. "Well, that depends. Grace here isn't microchipped, and there've been no missing dog reports that match her description. Technically, she'd go to the county shelter after a mandatory holding period, but with 6 puppies..." She trailed off, the implication clear. Marcus knew what happened to litters at overcrowded shelters. He'd seen it before, back when Emily was volunteering at the animal rescue in Denver. The memory hit him like a physical blow. Emily, covered in dog hair and mud, eyes shining as she talked about the 3-legged pit bull they'd saved that day. She'd made him promise that if anything ever happened to her, he'd keep fighting for the forgotten ones. What if someone wanted to take responsibility for them? The words came out before he could stop them. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "That's a significant commitment. 6 puppies plus mom means vaccinations, spay and neuter procedures, finding homes for the pups when they're old enough. We're talking months of care and considerable expense." Behind them, the office door chimed. Jake entered, stomping snow off his boots, carrying 2 steaming coffee cups from the diner across the street. "Figured you could use this," he said, offering one to Marcus. "How's our rescue operation looking?" "All healthy," Sarah replied. "We were just discussing their future." Jake studied his friend's face. He'd known Marcus for 5 years, ever since Marcus had shown up at the club broken and angry, looking for a place to disappear. Jake had seen him calm bar fights with nothing but a steady stare, watched him rebuild motorcycle engines with meticulous precision, but he'd never seen this particular expression before. It was the same look Marcus got when he stared too long at the photo he kept hidden in his wallet. Marcus took a sip of coffee, buying time. How could he explain that finding these dogs felt like more than coincidence? That Emily's voice seemed to whisper in every one of the puppy's tiny whimpers. "I've got the space," he said finally. "The cabin's got that fenced yard, and it's not like I'm using it for anything else." Sarah looked between the 2 men, sensing undercurrents she couldn't quite read. "Mr. Thompson," Marcus supplied. "Marcus Thompson." "Mr. Thompson, caring for a nursing mother and 6 puppies isn't like having a pet. It's a full-time job for the next several weeks. And that's assuming you can find good homes for all the puppies once they're weaned." Jake snorted. "You haven't seen his place. Doc Guy's got a workshop that's cleaner than most operating rooms. If anyone can handle the responsibility, it's Marcus." Through the examination room window, Marcus could see the storm was finally beginning to ease. The wind had died down, and the snow fell in gentle flakes instead of the angry torrents that had raged all day. In a few hours, the roads would be clear enough for travel. He could walk away, let the system handle these animals, and go back to his quiet, controlled life. But Grace chose that moment to lift her head and look directly at him, her brown eyes holding the same trust Emily's had when she'd asked him to promise. The same faith that good people existed, that someone would always step up for those who couldn't fight for themselves. "I'll take them," he said quietly. "All of them." Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "I'll need references, and we'll have to set up a schedule for vaccinations and checkups. The puppies won't be ready to leave their mother for at least 8 weeks, whatever it takes." As if sensing the decision, one of the puppies, a small black and white male, opened his eyes for the first time and looked directly at Marcus. In that tiny face, Marcus saw possibility instead of ending, hope instead of loss. For the first time in 3 years, he smiled. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Marcus paced the small waiting room, his boots echoing against the linoleum. Through the frosted windows, dawn was breaking over Glacier Falls, painting the snow-covered streets in pale gold. He'd been here for 3 hours, ever since Doc Henley had taken the mother dog into surgery. Sarah Chen sat in one of the plastic chairs, cradling the smallest puppy in a blanket. The little one had been touch and go all night, but its breathing had finally steadied. The other 2 puppies slept peacefully in a makeshift pen Doc Henley had set up, heat lamps keeping them warm. "You should get some coffee," Sarah said softly, watching Marcus wear a path in the floor. "There's a diner across the street." Marcus shook his head. "Not leaving until I know she's okay." The irony wasn't lost on him. 24 hours ago, he'd been running from his past, putting distance between himself and anyone who might need him. Now he couldn't walk away from a stray dog and her babies. Emma would have laughed at that, would have said he was finally remembering who he used to be. The surgery door opened, and Doc Henley emerged, pulling off latex gloves. His weathered face was unreadable as he approached them. "Well?" Marcus asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "She's a fighter," the veterinarian said, a tired smile creasing his features. "The internal bleeding was worse than I thought, and she had a nasty infection from the delivery, but she's stable now, going to be touch and go for the next day or 2, but I think she'll make it." Marcus felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. "Can we see her?" "In a little while. She's still sedated." Doc Henley studied Marcus with curious eyes. "You know, in 40 years of practice, I've seen a lot of good Samaritans, but most people would have dropped them off and left. Why are you still here?" Marcus glanced at Sarah, then at the sleeping puppies. How could he explain that these helpless creatures had become his anchor to something he thought he'd lost forever? That caring for them felt like honoring Emma's memory in a way that running never could. "Just want to make sure they're all right," he said finally. Sarah stood, still holding the smallest puppy. "Dr. Henley, what happens to them now, when they're healthy enough to leave?" The old man shrugged. "Normally they'd go to the county shelter. It's overcrowded, though, and with 4 dogs. He didn't need to finish the sentence. "No." The word came out harder than Marcus intended. Both Sarah and Doc Henley looked at him. "That's not happening." "Marcus," Sarah said gently, "they need homes, real homes with families who can care for them properly." "I know." He ran a hand through his hair, thinking fast. "But not the shelter. There has to be another way." The question hung in the air. Marcus thought about his bike, his transient lifestyle, his determination to keep moving. Then he looked at the puppies again, so small and vulnerable, depending on the kindness of strangers. "I don't know," he admitted. "My life isn't exactly set up for pets." "Life has a way of changing our plans," the veterinarian said. "Sometimes for the better." Sarah's phone buzzed, and she glanced at it. "The road crews have cleared the highway. I need to get back to Missoula soon." She looked at Marcus. "What about you? Where were you headed before all this?" Before all this. Before he'd found a family of strays in a snowstorm and remembered what it felt like to be needed, he'd been running toward nothing and away from everything that mattered. "Doesn't matter where I was going," he said. "Question is where I'm going now." The smallest puppy stirred in Sarah's arms, making tiny squeaking sounds. She transferred the little bundle to Marcus, and he found himself looking down into sleepy, unfocused eyes. "They're going to need names," Sarah said. Marcus felt the puppy's heartbeat against his palm, steady and strong despite everything it had endured. Something shifted inside him, like tumblers falling into place in a long, locked door. "Hope," he said quietly. "This one's Hope." Doc Henley smiled. "That's a good start. What about the others?" Marcus looked at the 2 puppies sleeping under the heat lamps, then toward the surgery room where their mother was fighting to recover. For the first time in months, he wasn't thinking about the road ahead or the past behind him. He was thinking about tomorrow, and the day after that, and all the small moments that made up a life worth living. "One thing at a time," he said. Let's get them all healthy first. But even as he spoke, he knew he was already lost. These 4 strays had found him at exactly the moment when he needed to be found. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Marcus watched Dr. Sarah Chen examine the smallest puppy under a heat lamp. The tiny creature's breathing had grown shallow during the night, and despite the warmth and milk replacer, he wasn't responding like his litter mates. His core temperature is still too low, Dr. Chen murmured, a stethoscope moving across the puppy's fragile chest. Hypothermia this severe in newborns. Sometimes there's organ damage we can't see. Marcus felt his throat tighten. He'd carried that puppy against his chest for miles through the blizzard, felt its heartbeat through his leather jacket. The idea that it might not make it seemed impossible after everything they'd survived. "What can we do?" he asked, unconsciously lowering his voice to avoid disturbing Bella, who lay nursing 3 of her babies in a nearby kennel. "Keep doing what we're doing. Warmth, nutrition, monitoring. Sometimes they rally." Dr. Chen's eyes met his. "Sometimes they don't. You saved their lives out there, Mr. Torres. Don't forget that." The clinic door chimed, and Marcus tensed instinctively. Old habits from years of looking over his shoulder, but it was only Jenny Martinez, the animal control officer, who'd helped coordinate the rescue. She carried a steaming cup of coffee and a manila folder thick with paperwork. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering Marcus the coffee. "And I've got an update on our Jane Doe." Marcus accepted the coffee gratefully. "Find out who she was?" Jenny's expression grew somber. "Rebecca Walsh, 26, from Billings. Her car's been in the impound lot since yesterday morning. Someone called in the accident around dawn. Looks like she'd been out there most of the night." The weight of it settled on Marcus like a stone. Rebecca Walsh. A name, not just a victim. Someone's daughter, maybe someone's sister. He thought of her final words about the dogs, how even in her last moment she'd been thinking about saving them. "Any family?" he asked. "Sister in Seattle. She's flying in today." Jenny hesitated. "She wanted me to thank whoever found Rebecca. I told her about you, about what you did for the dogs." Marcus stared down at his coffee. He'd spent so many years running from connection, from the messiness of other people's lives. But sitting here in this bright, antiseptic room, he couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had shifted inside him. It was a question he'd been avoiding, even in his own mind. The smart thing would be to walk away, let the professionals handle placement, return to his solitary life on the road, no strings attached. But every time he looked at Bella's trusting eyes or felt the warm weight of a puppy in his palm, that option seemed less possible. "I don't know," he admitted. I'm not really set up for pets." "Bella's going to need stability," Dr. Chen said gently. "Somewhere safe to raise her babies, and given what she's been through, she'll do better with someone she already trusts." Marcus thought about his sparse apartment in Missoula, his irregular schedule, his motorcycle that couldn't exactly accommodate a dog carrier. Then he thought about Rebecca Walsh, dying alone in the snow, and how sometimes life demanded that you change your plans. The smallest puppy stirred under the heat lamp, letting out a sound barely louder than a whisper. Marcus moved closer, watching the tiny chest rise and fall with determined breaths. "Come on, little fighter," he murmured. "Don't give up now." Jenny was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You know, my cousin runs a house-sitting business for people who travel, lots of folks with big properties who need reliable caretakers. Might be perfect for someone with your flexible lifestyle." It felt like pieces of a puzzle clicking together, though Marcus wasn't sure he was ready for the picture they formed. A stable home base, responsibility for living creatures who depended on him, roots in a community he'd only planned to pass through. His phone buzzed. A text from Tank. "How's our 4-legged friends? Club's taking up a collection for vet bills." Marcus stared at the message, remembering how the Devil's disciples had mobilized to help with the rescue, no questions asked. Maybe he'd been wrong about having no community. Maybe he'd been building one without realizing it. The puppy under the lamp stretched one tiny paw, and Marcus carefully extended his finger. The puppy's paw wrapped around it with surprising strength, and Marcus felt something tight in his chest finally begin to loosen. "Tell me more about this house-sitting thing," he said to Jenny, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what he was considering. Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind a world transformed by snow and possibility. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Jake paced the narrow hallway, his boots clicking against the linoleum. Through the examination room's glass window, he could see Dr. Martinez working over the smallest puppy, the one they'd almost lost twice during the night. Sarah stood beside him, her hand pressed against the glass, watching every movement inside. "She's been in there for 40 minutes, Sarah whispered, her breath fogging the window slightly. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her clothes still bore traces of yesterday's ordeal, mud stains on her jeans, a small tear in her jacket sleeve from crawling through the underbrush. Jake stopped pacing and moved beside her. The puppy lay motionless on the examination table, barely visible beneath the tangle of monitoring wires and heating pads. "Martinez knows what she's doing. Best vet in 3 counties. You keep saying that." Sarah's voice carried a tremor she couldn't quite hide. "But look at him. He's so small, so—" "Hey!" Jake's weathered hand found her shoulder. "Yesterday you thought they were all going to die in that ditch. Now 4 of them are sleeping peacefully in there, and Mama Dog is eating like she hasn't seen food in weeks." Through another window they could see Luna curled in a large kennel with her 4 healthier puppies. The German Shepherd mix had transformed overnight from the terrified, protective mother they'd found to a dog who wagged her tail when they approached. Her ribs still showed through her coat, but her eyes had lost that desperate, wild look. "I keep thinking about the timing," Sarah said. "If you hadn't come along when you did, if you hadn't stopped." Jake shifted uncomfortably. "Someone else would have—" Sarah turned to face him fully. "We both know that's not true. That stretch of highway, in that weather, I was out there for over an hour before you showed up. You were it, Jake. You were their only chance." The examination room door opened, interrupting them. Dr. Martinez emerged, pulling off latex gloves, her expression unreadable. She was a compact woman in her 50s, with graying hair pulled back and the steady hands Jake had seen work miracles on everything from injured wildlife to prize-winning cattle. "Well?" Sarah's question came out barely above a whisper. "He's stable." Dr. Martinez managed a tired smile. "Hypothermia, severe dehydration, and he's underweight even for his age. But his vitals are strengthening. The warming protocol worked." Jake felt tension he hadn't realized he'd been carrying drain from his shoulders. "So he's going to make it?" Sarah looked at Jake, then back at the doctor. "I've been thinking about that all night. I can't take them back to Seattle. My apartment doesn't allow pets, and even if it did—" "You travel too much," Jake said quietly. "Your job." "Exactly." Sarah's voice grew stronger, more decisive. "But I can't just abandon them either. Not after this." Dr. Martinez nodded slowly. The shelter in Billings might take them, but with winter coming and their condition— She didn't need to finish the sentence. They all knew overcrowded shelters had to make hard choices. "What about temporary fostering?" Jake found himself asking. "Until they're stronger, old enough to be properly adopted?" Both women looked at him with surprise. Sarah's eyebrows rose. "Jake, are you saying—" "I've got the space." The words tumbled out before he could second-guess them. "Property's fenced, house is warm. Been thinking about getting a dog anyway." That last part was a lie, but somehow it felt like it could become true. The silence stretched between them until Dr. Martinez cleared her throat. "That could work. Luna's going to need careful monitoring for the next few weeks, and the puppies won't be ready for adoption until they're at least 8 weeks old. There may be 4 weeks now." "A month," Sarah said thoughtfully. "I could help. I could extend my assignment here, work remotely for a while." Jake studied her face. "You sure about that? Yesterday you couldn't wait to get back to the city." "Yesterday feels like a lifetime ago." Sarah turned back to the window where the smallest puppy was now stirring slightly under his heat lamps. "Besides, someone needs to make sure you don't teach them to ride motorcycles." Despite everything, Jake found himself almost smiling. Might not be the worst skill to have in Montana. Dr. Martinez looked between them, with the expression of someone who'd seen enough unlikely partnerships work out to know better than to question this one. All right then, let's talk about care schedules, feeding requirements, and follow-up appointments. You're both about to become very busy people. Outside, the morning sun was burning through the last of the storm clouds, casting long shadows across the snow-covered parking lot. Through the windows, Jake could see his Harley parked next to Sarah's sedan, both vehicles bearing evidence of yesterday's rescue mission. The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Marcus sat in the corner of the examination room watching Dr. Sarah Chen work her magic on the smallest puppy. 3 days had passed since the rescue, and while 4 of the 5 pups were thriving, this little one, barely the size of his palm, struggled with every breath. "Come on, fighter," Sarah murmured, adjusting the tiny oxygen mask. "Your mama didn't survive that storm just to lose you now." Marcus felt his chest tighten. The mother dog, whom he'd taken to calling Storm, lay on a nearby blanket with her healthy pups nursing contentedly. Her amber eyes tracked every movement around her smallest baby, a soft whine escaping her throat. "The pneumonia's responding to treatment," Sarah said without looking up. "But the next 24 hours are critical." The clinic door chimed, and Marcus looked up to see Jake entering with 2 steaming coffee cups and a worried expression. Behind him came an unexpected figure, Detective Ray Castellanos, still wearing his rumpled suit from what had obviously been a long day. "Figured I'd find you here," Ray said, his voice carrying none of its usual authority. "How's the little one?" "Fighting," Marcus replied simply. Ray nodded, then cleared his throat. "Look, I came to tell you something. The investigation into Emma's accident, it's been officially closed." Marcus's hands stilled on Storm's fur. "And?" "Mechanical failure. Pure and simple. The brake lines corroded due to road salt exposure. No foul play, no negligence, just sometimes terrible things happen to good people." The words hung in the air like smoke. Marcus had spent 15 years believing someone was responsible, someone he could hunt down and make pay. The truth felt both liberating and hollow. "I thought you should hear it from me," Ray continued. "Also thought you should know. The community's been talking about what you did out there. Word travels fast in small towns." Sarah glanced up from her patient. "Half the county's been calling, wanting to help with vet bills. And there's a reporter from Billings who wants to interview you." "I figured you'd say that." Ray pulled up a chair. "But there's something else. The fire department's looking for volunteers. Chief Morrison specifically asked about you." Marcus almost smiled at the irony. A Hell's Angel on the volunteer fire department? "Stranger things have happened," Jake said, settling into another chair. "Besides, you've got more rescue experience than most of our guys combined." The tiny puppy's breathing seemed to ease slightly, and Sarah made a note on her chart. "I think he's turning the corner. Whatever you want to name him, Marcus, better make it something strong. He's not mine to name." "Actually," a new voice interrupted, "I think he is." They all turned to see a young woman in the doorway, maybe 25, with auburn hair and eyes that reminded Marcus painfully of Emma's. She wore scrubs and had the confident bearing of someone comfortable in medical settings. "I'm sorry," she said. "I'm Annie Kovac. I work at the Children's Hospital in Billings, but I grew up here. My grandfather was Thomas Kovac." The name hit Marcus like a physical blow. Tom Kovac, the man whose truck had collided with Emma's car that icy night 15 years ago. The man who'd died on impact, leaving Marcus with no target for his rage except the world itself. "He was driving to help deliver a baby," Annie continued, her voice steady but emotional. "Mrs. Patterson's granddaughter. The roads were terrible, but he was the only one who could get through. When I heard about what you did, saving this family in the storm, I had to come." Marcus couldn't speak. The room felt like it was spinning. "Grandpa would have stopped that night if he'd seen your daughter," Annie said. "He stopped for every stranded motorist, every injured animal, every person who needed help. That's who he was. And from what I hear, that's who you are too." Sarah continued working, but Everyone else sat in stunned silence. The machines beeped softly, marking time in a moment that seemed to stretch toward eternity. "The thing is," Annie said, kneeling down next to Storm, "I think maybe you both stopped that night because you're the same kind of people, the kind who can't drive past someone in trouble. And maybe that little girl's watching over both your families now." The smallest puppy stirred under Sarah's gentle touch, his breathing growing stronger. Storm's tail thumped once against the floor, as if in agreement. Marcus looked around the room, at Jake, who'd become an unlikely friend, at Ray, who delivered truth instead of the vengeance Marcus had craved, at Sarah, working tirelessly to save a life, at Annie, who'd turned his world upside down with compassion instead of accusation. "Phoenix," he said quietly. "What?" Sarah asked. "The puppy's name. Phoenix." Marcus touched the tiny animal's head with one finger. "Because sometimes you have to burn everything down before you can rise again." The veterinary clinic's fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Maggie watched the last puppy nurse contentedly against its mother's warm belly. 3 days had passed since Jake carried them through the clinic doors, and the transformation was remarkable. What had been barely breathing bundles of wet fur were now plump, active creatures with bright eyes and tiny tails that wagged with increasing vigor. "They're going to make it," Dr. Sarah Chen said softly, checking the chart one final time. "All of them." "I wasn't sure about the smallest one, but look at her now." The runt of the litter, no bigger than Jake's palm when he'd found them, was now determinedly pushing her larger siblings aside to claim her spot at the milk bar. Maggie, as Jake had taken to calling the mother, lifted her head and fixed him with those intelligent brown eyes that seemed to hold an entire conversation. "She knows," Jake murmured, gently stroking the dog's ears. "She knows we're not going to let anything happen to them." Sarah smiled, but Jake caught the concern that flickered across her face. "What happens now?" "Animal control has been asking questions. 3 days is pushing the limit for strays without proper documentation." The familiar weight settled in Jake's chest, the same feeling he'd carried since childhood, watching from foster home windows as other kids got picked up by loving families. He'd learned early that good things were temporary, that safety was always borrowed time. "I've been thinking about that," he said, his voice rougher than intended. Before Sarah could respond, the clinic's bell chimed. Heavy footsteps echoed down the hallway, and Jake tensed instinctively. But instead of the uniformed animal control officer he'd been dreading, Tommy Martinez appeared in the doorway, his club colors prominent on his leather vest. "Road dog," Tommy nodded, then stopped short when he saw the canine family nestled in their warming bed. His weathered face softened in a way that would have surprised anyone who'd only seen him astride his Harley. "Well, I'll be damned. These the little fighters I've been hearing about." Sarah looked between the two bikers uncertainly, but Jake made quick introductions. Tommy crouched down, extending his fingers for Maggie to sniff. She considered him carefully before allowing a tentative tail wag. "Got good instincts," Tommy observed. "Knows people. This one does." "Tommy, what are you doing here?" Jake felt something shift in his chest, a loosening he hadn't expected. "You're serious?" "Dead serious. Linda's already been researching puppy care online, drove me half crazy with questions about what kind of food to buy, how to puppy-proof the house. Woman's got it all planned out." Tommy's voice carried the affectionate exasperation of a man who'd been happily married for 15 years. "Course, we'd only want one if you think it's right. Don't want to overstep." Sarah cleared her throat. "I might have a solution for the others, too. I've been making calls to some colleagues. Dr. Williams in Bozeman specializes in rescue placements, and she's got a waiting list of pre-approved families. Good families who've been through background checks, home visits, the works." Jake looked down at Maggie, who was watching him with those knowing eyes. It was as if she understood every word, was waiting for his decision. The smallest puppy, the fighter, had finished nursing and was now attempting to climb over her mother's front leg, determination written in every wobbly movement. "There's something else," Tommy said quietly, "about Maggie herself." Linda and I, we've got the space, the experience. Raised kids and cats and half the neighborhood strays over the years. If you're looking for someone to take the mama too." The offer hung in the air like a prayer answered. Jake had been trying not to think about this moment when he'd have to say goodbye to the dog who'd somehow become his anchor in just 3 short days. He told himself it was about doing right by her, finding her the best home possible. But sitting here now, watching her gentle patience with her babies, her quiet trust in him, Jake realized he'd been hoping for exactly this kind of miracle. "She deserves a ranch," he said finally, his voice thick. "Space to run, kids to look after. She's got that protective instinct." Tommy nodded seriously. "She'll be family. You have my word." "And you'll always be welcome to visit," Sarah added. "Professional checkups, of course, but also just whenever you want to see how they're doing." Outside, the Montana wind rattled the clinic windows, but inside, surrounded by the soft sounds of contented puppies and the quiet breathing of their mother, Jake felt something he'd almost forgotten existed, the possibility of happy endings. The first rays of dawn painted the snow-covered landscape in shades of amber and rose. But Jake barely noticed the beauty. His focus remained entirely on the small bundle of life cradled against his chest inside his leather jacket. The smallest puppy, the one Sarah had fought so hard to save, was breathing, but each tiny breath came with tremendous effort. "Come on, little fighter," he whispered, his calloused fingers gently stroking the puppy's downy fur. "Your mama didn't make it this far just to lose you now." Sarah lay in the passenger seat, exhaustion etched into every line of her face. The other 3 puppies were nestled in a makeshift bed Jake had created from his spare shirt and an emergency blanket, their small bodies finally warm and breathing steadily. But this 4th one, this tiny survivor who had been born into a world of ice and abandonment, was slipping away despite everything they'd done. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and Jake pressed harder on the accelerator. The nearest veterinary clinic was still 40 miles away, and he knew with sickening certainty that they might not make it in time. The irony wasn't lost on him. After everything he'd survived, everything he'd overcome, he was about to be defeated by his inability to save one small life. "Tell me about your children," Sarah said quietly, her voice barely audible over the engine's rumble. Jake's jaw tightened. He'd shared more with this stranger in one night than he had with anyone in years, but that particular wound remained too raw, too deep. "I don't talk about that. The tattoo on your arm," she pressed gently. "Emma and Michael. Those aren't just names." His hands gripped the steering wheel tighter, knuckles white against the black leather of his gloves. The puppy stirred weakly against his chest, and Jake felt the familiar crushing weight of helplessness, the same feeling that had driven him onto the road 3 years ago, running from a pain too enormous to bear. "They died," he said finally. The words scraped raw from his throat. "House fire. I was on deployment, couldn't get home in time. My wife, she didn't make it out either." Sarah's intake of breath was sharp, pained. "Jake, I'm so sorry. I was supposed to protect them." The confession poured out of him like blood from a wound. "That was my job, my only job that mattered, and I failed. I came home to nothing but ashes and funeral arrangements." The puppy's breathing grew more labored, and Jake felt something breaking inside him all over again. "I can't lose another one," he whispered. "I can't." But even as he spoke, he felt the tiny body growing weaker, the small heartbeat fluttering like a bird's wing against his chest. The veterinary clinic was still 20 miles away, and Jake knew with the bitter wisdom of experience that sometimes love wasn't enough, that sometimes fighting wasn't enough, that sometimes good people lost everything despite their best efforts. "You didn't fail them," Sarah said firmly. "And you're not failing this puppy. Look what you've already done. You saved their mother, you brought them to safety, you've given them a chance they never would have had. That's not failure, Jake, that's grace." The word hit him like a physical blow. Grace. It was the last thing he felt he deserved, the last thing he thought he was capable of offering. He'd spent 3 years believing himself to be broken beyond repair, convinced that his inability to save his family had marked him as fundamentally flawed. But as the sun climbed higher, painting the Montana sky in brilliant shades of hope, Jake felt something shift inside him. The puppy was still fighting, still clinging to life with the same stubborn determination that had kept Sarah going through the storm. Maybe that was enough. Maybe the fight itself mattered, regardless of the outcome. There, Sarah pointed ahead, her voice filled with relief. The clinic. Jake saw the small building nestled among a cluster of pine trees, a simple wooden sign proclaiming Mountain View Veterinary Services. Smoke rose from the chimney, and lights glowed warmly in the windows. It looked like salvation. As he pulled into the parking lot, Jake felt the puppy stir more strongly against his chest. The tiny creature lifted its head for the first time, eyes still closed but somehow more alert, more present. It was such a small thing, barely perceptible, but to Jake it felt like witnessing a miracle. "He's going to make it," Sarah breathed, tears streaming down her face. "They're all going to make it." Jake sat in the truck for a moment, cradling the puppy, feeling the weight of possibility settling around him like a warm blanket. For the first time in 3 years, he dared to believe that maybe broken things could be mended, that maybe grace wasn't something you earned, but something you discovered in the most unlikely places. Sometimes salvation came wearing a leather jacket and riding a Harley. Sometimes it was simply the willingness to stop when others would drive past, to care when caring hurt too much, to fight for life even when death had taken everything else away. The morning sun painted the snow-covered mountains in shades of gold and pink as Marcus sat in the veterinary clinic's waiting room, his leather jacket draped over the back of the chair. Through the large windows he could see the town of Glacier Creek coming to life, shop owners sweeping snow from their storefronts, children building snowmen in the park across the street, steam rising from coffee cups as early commuters hurried past. Dr. Sarah Chen emerged from the examination room, her face bright with the kind of smile that made Marcus's chest tighten with hope. "They're all doing beautifully," she announced. "Mama's recovered completely from her ordeal, and the puppies are thriving. That runt you were so worried about, he's actually gained the most weight." Marcus felt something he hadn't experienced in years, pure, uncomplicated joy. "Can I see them?" "Of course. But I should warn you, they're getting quite attached to you." Inside the examination room, the mother dog, whom Marcus had taken to calling Grace, lifted her head and her tail began a gentle thump against the blanket. The 5 puppies, now plump and active, tumbled over each other in their eagerness to reach him. The smallest one, the fighter who'd nearly died in his hands that first night, somehow managed to climb over his siblings and reach Marcus first. "Hey there, little warrior," Marcus whispered, scooping up the tiny golden bundle. The puppy immediately began licking his fingers with determined enthusiasm. Dr. Chen leaned against the doorframe, watching. "You know, I've been a vet for 15 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what you did out there. Most people would have driven right past." Marcus settled onto the floor, letting the other puppies climb into his lap, while Grace nuzzled his shoulder. "I almost did," he admitted. "Probably should have, considering where I was headed. Where were you going, if you don't mind me asking?" For a moment, Marcus was quiet, running his fingers through Grace's fur. "Away," he said finally. "Just away from everything. My past, my mistakes, the person I used to be. I thought maybe if I rode far enough, fast enough, I could outrun it all. And now?" Marcus looked down at the puppy in his palm. So small he could hold him in one hand, yet so determined to live. "Now I think maybe running isn't the answer. Maybe the answer is staying and figuring out how to be better." The clinic door chimed, and voices drifted in from the waiting room. Dr. Chen glanced toward the sound, then back at Marcus. "Looks like word has gotten out about our miracle family. Half the town wants to meet the man who saved them." Through the partially open door, Marcus could see a small crowd gathering. An elderly woman with kind eyes, a young family with children pressing their faces against the window, a rancher in worn jeans holding a steaming cup of coffee. Their faces held curiosity, certainly, but also something else, acceptance, maybe even admiration. "Marcus?" a familiar voice called from the waiting room. He looked up to see Tom Bradley, the tow truck driver who'd helped him that first night. Behind him stood Sheriff Patricia Hawkins, no longer the suspicious law enforcement officer who'd questioned him, but a woman with genuine warmth in her eyes. "We heard about what you did," Sheriff Hawkins said, stepping into the room. "The whole story, how you stayed with them all night in that storm, how you saved their lives." Tom nodded, his weathered face creased with respect. "Highway Patrol found your bike this morning. Managed to dig her out and get her running. She's parked outside whenever you're ready." Marcus felt a familiar flutter of anxiety, the old instinct to flee, to get back on the road before anyone looked too closely at who he really was. But as Grace rested her head against his arm and the puppies continued their determined assault on his shoelaces, he realized something had fundamentally changed inside him. "Actually," he said, surprising himself with the steadiness of his own voice, "I was wondering if anyone around here might be looking for help. Ranch work, maybe, or anything, really. I've got some experience with animals, apparently." The rancher in the waiting room stepped forward, extending a calloused hand. "Jim Morrison. I've got a spread about 10 miles east of town. Lost my foreman to retirement last month. Pays decent, comes with a cabin. You'd be working with cattle mostly, but I've got dogs too. Could use someone who understands them." Marcus shook the offered hand, feeling the weight of possibilities settling around him like a warm coat. I'd like that. I'd like that very much." As if sensing the momentous nature of the decision, the smallest puppy gave a tiny yip and promptly fell asleep in Marcus's palm, completely trusting, completely content. Sometimes salvation didn't come from running towards something or away from something. Sometimes it came from simply stopping, staying still long enough to let love find you in the most unexpected places.